She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I am here today with a new broad for you. Today we are going to talk about Galina Brok-Beltsova. And I'm super excited to bring her to you today. She actually is a suggestion from a one-time guest on the podcast, but longtime friend and contributor to lists of names of amazing women that we ought to be covering, Mr. Joe Lex. I don't know if you guys, if you've been listening to the podcast a long time, you might remember back, gosh, it was like maybe 2 years ago now-ish, that Joe brought us Amy Ernesta Drinker Bullet Bo Barlow, aka Commander Mary. She was a trip. She was proposed to like hundreds of times and accepted none of them. She was amazing. And Joe himself is also a podcaster. He has a podcast, All Bones Considered, the Laurel Hill Stories. He's over in Pennsylvania, and he's an expert on all the people buried in that cemetery. And so whenever he comes across new broads and broads he sees, he sends them to me. And so Galina is one of these women that he sent me this week. Thank you, Joe. Listeners, if you've never actually submitted a broad, I do read the submissions and they do go on my list. It's really cool to explore new women, but this woman is kind of new. Like, we haven't covered her specifically. But the reason she is in the limelight is that the New York Times just wrote an obituary for her because she just died. And she was, some of y'all remember, the Night Witches, one of my very favorite episodes we've ever done on this podcast. Galina Brok-Belsova was the last surviving Night Witch. And she just died in August 14th, I think. Let me scroll down. August 15th. So close. At the age of 99, she just died. So I just want to take an episode and talk about her specifically. I actually, embarrassingly, this happens all the time where I do the research, but I haven't, followed every trail to its end. And I didn't even know any of them were still alive. Although it shouldn't be that surprising because a lot of people live to 100 these days. But she is the very last one. And the New York Times did this lovely obituary. And I am, if you listened last week, I've been in the middle of quite a lot of hubbub. We had the breast cancer fundraiser was on Sunday and it went really well. We're still trying to raise a few more funds for it. So keep a lookout on the page. I'll probably share a link to that, that if you'd like to donate, if you'd like to support breast cancer warriors who are fighting the fight and their families who need the support. But that went really well, and I'm rehearsing for a show that opens in November, and so my time has still been extremely tight. And I'm going to do something I never do. I'm just going to read from the obituary, because it's actually quite good. I don't know if you all have read the obituary section of the New York Times. It might seem a little weird and morbid, but they actually do a really lovely job in their research. I find their research is usually very good from multiple sources. And Galina's obituary is there, and I think it's like the perfect encapsulation of not only what the Night Witches did, but what she specifically did. And she was a real character. But before we dig into Galina and her story specifically, I just want to give everybody a little mini refresher about the Night Witches, the Nachthexen, as the Germans called them. If you haven't listened to that full episode, you absolutely should check it out. They are some of the most unsung heroes, certainly female heroes, in the more recent wars of the world wars. But the Night Witches basically were all female aviation units that were barely like Stalin gave this nod after the head of their department, the woman who would end up being the head of their department, begged and said, we have all these women that want to fight that had been writing her letters. And she begged to start this aviation unit. And Stalin said yes, and they gave him all this hand-me-down equipment because they didn't have equipment women's sizes, and they gave him these terrible planes. And these women basically their planes were like balsa wood with canvas stretched over them. They had no fancy navigation equipment. They were doing all their navigation by hand and calculations, rulers, etc. But the way that they would bomb the German camps is that they would fly up to a very high height, and they would cut their engines, and they would swoop down over the camp in silence and drop the bomb, circle around to update the formation so that a different plane was in the front, drop the second bomb, then do the same thing, drop the third bomb, and then these women would climb out onto the wing of the plane and restart their engine in midair, and they would fly away. And they would return back with bullet holes everywhere, all over the plane and their helmets and things. And it was wild. And they turned the tide of World War II. And they weren't allowed to march in the victory parade in Moscow because they were women. And, you know, women weren't even really supposed to be serving, but these women had kind of squeezed between the cracks. But they made a big difference in the war. So anyway, that is like the very short, abbreviated version of the incredible Night Witches. So let's dig into Galina and her story. And I'm just going to read right from this obit because it's awesome. When Galina Brok-Beltsova flew her first combat mission during the Second World War, the Soviet airwoman was mesmerized by the spangled night sky. It was only after the 18-year-old returned to base that she was told it was anti-aircraft fire that had eluded her. Her next challenge as the navigator of the twin-engined Petyakov PE-2 dive bomber was to read the vast monochrome landscape. After invading the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Nazis razed villages and forests of captured territory, rendering her maps useless. Quote, "We were firing and hurling down bombs, but we couldn't understand where we were," end quote. On one occasion, as the bomb aired, she was unable to drop the payload. A mid-air collision with another Soviet aircraft while weaving to avoid enemy fire had incapacitated the mechanism for dropping the bombs. Forced into an emergency landing that could blow up the dive bomber, her pilot Antonina Bondareva-Spitsina landed as gently as possible and let the aircraft roll on till it nosed into a trench and the bombs nestled in sand, unexploded. On another sortie, she and their dive bomber became detached from the formation, including the escort fighter planes, and were attacked by two Focke-Wulfs. As they closed in, she could see the terrible smiles, quote, on the faces of the gunners. The arrival of Soviet fighter aircraft saved them. Sitting back to back with the pilot and ready to spring into the gun turret to fire the Berezin machine gun, Brok-Beltsova flew 36 combat missions in what she called her, quote, beautiful bird of prey. She took part in Operation Bagration to liberate Belarusia in June 1944, which enabled the Red Army to advance into Central Europe. Her final sortie was the bombing of Königsberg, which is present-day Kaliningrad, which the Germans surrendered on April 9th, 1945. Surveying the ruined city from the air, she felt no remorse. Brok-Beltsova later received a personal thank you letter from Stalin. The Soviet airwomen became popularly known as night witches. Quote, "We were all so young," she recalled. "Some of the women were so beautiful. We, of course, preferred to be called night beauties, but whichever," end quote. Galina Pavlovna Brok was born in 1925 in Moscow, where her father ran a factory. She was 16 in the summer of 1941 when she emerged from a cinema in Moscow to see Nazi bombs rain down on the city. Amid the wail of air raid sirens, she ran to a nearby military office and volunteered. Quote, "They were attacking my city. There was panic in the streets. What else could I do? It was my duty, end quote. On entering the 587th, later renamed the 125th Regiment, one of 3 all-female aviation regiments in the Soviet Union, she recalled meeting women in their early 20s whose uniforms were festooned with medals. Recruits looked up to them as hardened veterans. Chief among them was Marina Roskova, the founding and commanding officer of the regiment and the first professional air navigator in the Soviet Union. Roskova had lobbied Stalin to set up 3 female aviator regiments in 1941, more than 50 years before women were allowed to fly in combat missions in the U.S. Air Force. That happened in 1933, and the Royal Air Force, RAF, in 1994. Russians beat the U.S. and England by over 50 years. She was considered so exemplary that Brok-Beltsova was given a photograph of her to carry in the leg of her flight suit and look at her if her nerves began to fail her. Quote, "She was brave, so we were brave." Roskova would die in an air crash in 1943. Brok-Beltsova trained at Samara on the Volga with 300 other women. Her billet was a stable full of frozen horse manure in temperatures of minus 30 degrees. The resourceful Brok-Beltsova found shovels and crowbars and organized a work party to break up the manure. It would be 1944 before her first mission, during which love might have come before war. In 1942, she was noticed by her commanding officer, Grigory Beltsov. He was much admired by many of her fellow female aviators in the regiment, but Galina rejected his overtures, refusing his hand when he offered it at dances and telling him that she wanted to focus on, quote, going to the front. He wrote her 3 letters a day, which she shared with comrades who were not receiving any letters at all. Quote, "They used to say, 'Galina, it's true love.'" At the end of the war, Beltsov tracked her down to Lithuania, where she was stationed, and got down on his knees. She refused him because she wanted to go to university. He said, quote, "I waited the whole war for you, and now, with your soldier's boots, you are trampling on the soul of a man who is devoted to you," end quote. When she saw his lips began to tremble, she changed her mind. The couple traded underwear to pay for a celebratory goose at their wedding. With training complete and their first mission approaching, a formation of male Soviet fighter pilots flew low over their dugout and dropped a large teddy bear. On it was a note, quote, "Dear young girls, we have just learned we are escorting you. Don't be frightened. We will do everything to defend you. Fight for you with the last drop of our blood. Thank you," end quote. Yet over the next year of combat, Brok-Beltsova wondered if it would be better to go down with the burning plane than to eject. Her twin fears were mistreatment, even rape at the hands of the Nazis if she were captured, and being sent to a Soviet gulag after the war for allowing herself to be captured. In the event she married her suitor, studied at Lomonosov Moscow State University, and completed her doctorate in 1960. I think I should say, in the end, she married her suitor. Whoops! New York Times. She taught the subject for 60 years, eventually becoming a professor and rising to become head of the history department at the Moscow Engineering Institute. She specialized on the Great Patriotic War. If anyone questioned her accounts of key battles, she only had to remind them she fought in them. Brok-Beltsova was also recruited by the KGB after the war and worked in counter-espionage. She used the money to help her family get enough to eat. Quote, "My father had a food card for 800 grams. My mother was sick, and my sister was still young. The 3 of them had to live with that food card." End quote. She did not tell her husband about the extracurricular activities. He died in 2005. She is survived by their 3 children. Believed to be the last survivor of the 1,000 Soviet female aviators who served in the Second World War, Brok-Beltsova lived in a veterans' village near Moscow on a state pension that was the equivalent of about 30 pounds a month. She continued to wear her ribbons, including the Order of Lenin, for her bravery, and a chain around her neck which hung a miniature gold PE2. She was proud of serving her country in the Great Patriotic War and in the KGB. But if she still believed Western culture to be bourgeois and decadent, she did not show it when invited to speak at a Women in Aviation International Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, where she learned to line dance at the age of 76 and drank all the other women under the table. Galina Pavlovna Brok-Beltsova, Soviet wartime airwoman, was born on February 12, 1925. She died on August 15th, 2024, age 99. And that, my friends, is the remarkable Galina Pavlovna Brok-Beltsova. Yikes, for someone who used to speak Russian very decently, I didn't do very well this episode. Hopefully y'all can forgive me. But what an incredible woman. What an incredible story. The story of the Night Witches still blows my mind every time I retell it. And she was just an incredible broad you should know. To learn more about Galina Brok-Belsova, see some pictures of her from that obituary, all that, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, you can click on over to the About page and read more about me. My bio, photo, links to all my stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know and Twitter at BYSK Podcast. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you're a fan of this podcast, please help spread the word about us. Share this episode with your friends and family, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps new listeners to find us. Broads You Should Know is produced and edited by me, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed this episode about Galina Brok-Beltsova, then I highly recommend you check out the episode we did on the Night Witches and hear their full story. But you also can check out a few other of the broads from World War II that fought in World War II, including Ludmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, who was the deadliest female sniper in history. And then we also have Christine Jorgensen, who was a World War II veteran and also the first widely known trans woman in the U.S. Josephine Baker, who in addition to being a jazz age sensation was also a World War II French spy. And then we also